Good evening, everyone.
And welcome to tonight's talk.
I'm Nikki from the Kellogg Hubbard Library, and we're pleased to be partnering with the League of Women Voters for this series. Before we get started, I'd like to let you know that this meeting is being recorded. Please remain muted throughout the presentation to ensure the best experience for all participants. If you have questions, please type them into the chat, and our moderator and speaker will address them. Now I'm excited to pass it over to Kate, who will introduce tonight's speaker and get us started.
Good evening. I'm Kate Rader with the League of Women Voters. Welcome to the fourth in this year's series on voter rights and access to the ballot. Tonight we discuss gerrymandering and mid-decade redistricting. To begin the program, I will turn the mic over to longtime moderator Tom McCone, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Kate. Our speaker tonight is Thomas Tighe. Thomas serves as a staff attorney at the League of Women Voters of the United States. In this role, he provides legal research and litigation support for the advocacy and litigation team. In his spare time, he enjoys hiking, travel, national parks, promoting affordable housing for all, and watching medieval history documentaries on the BBC. Thomas, welcome to Vermont.
Thank you all so much for having me, and we'll get started. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to stay on longer at the end to answer all your questions. And I truly appreciate all of your interest in this vital issue for democracy. So without further ado, I'll take it away. All right. So how do we get here in terms of modern redistricting? And I'm talking about this issue because redistricting is really often one and the same with gerrymandering in many states, sadly. And gerrymandering is an important issue because fundamentally gerrymandering by both parties really is an exercise of raw power that very much treats the voters as their tools to maintain their own power. So when you see states that chop up a city, like say Salt Lake City in Utah, or Dallas, Texas, or Houston, where they take these districts and snake them out into rural areas, that is a form of gerrymandering, where you dilute the power of one group of voters, those in the city who might vote more Democratic, and then attempt to drown them out via extra Republican votes, even if that city has no common interests with the rural areas it's now been combined in as a district. The same may be true for, say, having a more blue rural area, like the Democrats want to do in Virginia, where they divided up the very blue, very Democratic-leaning areas of Northern Virginia and snaked them out to various rural areas to divide up the rural vote that tends to vote more Republican and therefore create more Democratic districts. So it's important to think about gerrymandering at a very fundamental level, as in what is power being used for and what are the voters being used for? And here it's just being used to add more districts in our system of government to advantage one party or the other. So in terms of modern redistricting, the way we redistrict today in the United States is very much a relatively recent innovation in our republic. So in the 1960s, you may have learned this in high school or college, the United States Supreme Court handed out a series of decisions that really paved the way for how we redraw our congressional districts today. So the first of these was Baker v. Carr, and it allowed courts to rule on redistricting at all. Previous Supreme Court precedents had said that you couldn't actually have courts rule on congressional redistricting at all. They considered it very much to be a, quote, non-justiciable issue or a political question left to other branches of government. And then for our congressional districts, you had Wesbury versus Sanders, which required that congressional redistricting draw districts that ensured states' congressional districts have equal population. And previously, this was not the case. Before these decisions were handed down by the Supreme Court, states did not create equally populated congressional districts. For example, in the Wesbury v. Sanders case, this was a case out of Georgia, and the districts at issue were wildly unequal in population. One of the districts centered around Atlanta had 832,680 people, according to the 1960 census. Another district in another part of Georgia had just 272,154 people. So this meant that you had districts where one person's vote was almost 3 times as powerful um, as ones in Atlanta. And you can this and these changes really also filtered through to um, the state legislative level as well. For those of you who remember Vermont history, after Reynolds v. Sims, which was a companion case challenging state legislative apportionment, the Vermont legislature had to draw districts that were equal in population, where previously different towns were represented in districts that were wildly different in population. So this was a huge sea change, and these have been the bedrock cases that have provided some guidelines and foundations to our modern redistricting process. So the next change was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this was a monumental piece of legislation that required states to draw districts to ensure that voters of color could freely elect candidates of their choice. And this also re-enfranchised many voters of color in states that previously just barred them from voting completely. One of the tactics that was often used to dilute minority representation, which, for example, is packing and cracking, and it's still used today. But for example, you could have districts where you maximize the number of Black voters or Hispanic voters or Asian voters into a single district, and therefore allowing you to draw many majority white districts, even when you could have had multiple districts where multiple minority representatives could have been elected. Or cracking, where, for example, you crack, say, a majority Black community or area, and then divide them up among multiple districts that are majority white. And therefore, because of racially polarized voting, you will never elect a Black representative. It is almost an impossibility. And over the years, the Supreme Court has really refined the Voting Rights Act requirements to require states to draw districts in which people of color can elect candidates of their choice. If you can draw a compact district, and there's a clearly racially polarized voting, and also that the white majority and the minority voters in this jurisdiction vote very differently. For example, Mississippi, almost 90% of white voters vote for Republicans, almost 90% of Black voters vote for Democrats. And then also, if the totality of circumstances shows that there has been a lack of equal openness of the political system for voters of color, then the state will be required to draw districts that ensure that voters of color can elect a candidate of their choice. So mid-decade redistricting, which we've all seen over the last year or so, is actually not new. There are several states that have done mid-decade redistricting. You may have, those of you who remember Bush Jr. and Tom DeLay, who was majority leader at the time, they immediately redrew the districts in Texas in 2003 after the Republicans finally took full control of the state government for the first time since Reconstruction. And they did it to take out several rural white Democratic representatives to shore up their majority. In Georgia, after the Republicans had regained full control of state government for the first time since Reconstruction, they also redrew several districts to oust several white Democratic representatives. To be fair and important to note, this wasn't gerrymandering in Georgia. It wasn't just a Republican thing. Previous Democratic majorities, conservative Democratic majorities, had done ruthless gerrymandering with many tentacles and just outrageously shaped districts to hold on as long as they could. And they held on for a very long time, despite the shift of the South to Republican behavior. Colorado, the Republicans tried to rush through a new map that would favor them, but it didn't work. And the state Supreme Court ruled that the state constitution forbade mid-decade redistricting and struck it down. So they were stuck with a court-drawn map. And even before we all had modern redistricting, like I've just described, in the 19th century, some research shows that Ohio redrew maps repeatedly, with one analysis saying that 5 consecutive House elections were held using seven different maps. And then some states simply would not redistrict. Connecticut kept the same districts for around 70 years. So this is not new in terms of chicanery to try to rig your maps. It is a time-tested American tradition, sadly, not our proudest moments. And these slides are going to be shared later, and there are links for further information. So you can see this is what they did in Texas. You can see that they've drawn these they drew these wildly irregularly shaped districts to try to get rid of their political opponents. And it actually worked in the next few elections. So now we come to our current round of mid-decade redistricting. So to start, this all began in just July 2025 when President Trump ordered Texas to draw 5 additional Republican districts to bolster the House majority. Texas complied and they drew a new map, which was actually struck down for racial gerrymandering by a 3-judge panel, but allowed to go into effect for this election by the Supreme Court on the Supreme Court show called shadow docket or emergency docket, depending on how you want to call it. And this was the beginning of the redistricting war, which has not ended, because as the next slide, the Dems began to retaliate. So California immediately responded by placing a state constitutional amendment on the ballot to suspend its independent redistricting commission for the 2026, 2028, and 2030 elections. So they placed this ballot for the November 2025 special election. Placed this amendment on the ballot, and it won overwhelmingly. If you can see, the counties colored orange all voted yes, which meant that the commission is suspended and that for the next 3 election cycles, a gerrymander drawn by the California state legislature will be in effect for the voters of California. So this has all continued, and more states have decided to join the fray because politics in a 2-party system is a zero-sum game, and there's only one party that can control the United States House next election. So along with California, Virginia, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois have all began to consider or have already redrawn their districts. On the Republican side, along with Texas, you have Missouri, North Carolina, Florida, Kansas, New Hampshire, who have also begun to redraw their districts, are trying to, or already have done it. You also have court lawsuits in Utah, New York, and Wisconsin that have redrawn or seek to redraw their state's congressional districts. In Ohio, you have Republicans and Democrats who agreed to have a compromise map, a relatively mild pro-Republican gerrymander after a deal was struck by the members of the Redistricting Commission there. So you no doubt have heard from a lot of people or asked yourselves, how is this legal? How is this legal? Isn't this kind of an attack on voters of all stripes? And unfortunately for us here, it is legal. The vast majority of states actually do not ban mid-decade congressional redistricting. And only about 11 states have some kind of law or state Supreme Court precedent that bans mid-decade congressional or legislative redistricting. So in Colorado, as I mentioned before, in Nebraska, there are state Supreme Court cases that forbid mid-decade redistricting of congressional seats. Some laws in Connecticut, New York, and Utah forbid a mid-decade redraw unless ordered by a court. Utah is currently fighting out whether that's legal or not. For some background, our league in Utah is a plaintiff in a state court case that's gone on for years now, where in 2018 they passed a fair redistricting initiative. The legislature repealed it by gutting it with a lot of provisions in separate enabling legislation. Our state league in Utah went to court. So far, we've won in state court, and the commission is now back in effect. That's still on appeal, but now there's a fair congressional map in Utah. Hopefully, for this upcoming election, that's also being fought out in federal court, but that's another story for another day. So with all this very depressing landscape that I'm telling you now, what can we do about this? What can we do as an individual voter or citizen? So as it's become very clear now, there's no guardrails for much of redistricting beyond the good faith of your average state legislator, which I'm sure you've all probably figured out now. It's not a very good guardrail at all. It's simply the nature of many people who get empowered. So most of the states don't have any kind of independent redistricting commission or any law that constrains the legislature at all on mid-decade redistricting. And as I mentioned before, this is a 2-party system, and therefore it's a zero-sum game. You cannot afford as a political party to give up seats in the House if you wish to have power. Even once you've discarded any ethics and morality and fairness, which political parties tend to do, you have no reason not to maximize your power. by gerrymandering. So the moment this equilibrium was upset by Texas, everyone had every incentive to keep going as much as you could. And you can definitely see that this is reflected in proposed maps. So Indiana chose not to redistrict after it was voted down in their state senate, despite massive pressure from the White House. But the districts you see here, had they been passed, you would have had 0 Democratic representatives at all in Indiana. This was done by chopping up Indianapolis into 3 pieces, as you can see in the center right there with that purple, green, and yellow districts. And then if you look at the northwest corner, which is Gary, Indiana, the suburbs of Chicago, that would have been mixed with a bunch of rural areas that vote reliably Republican. You would have therefore annihilated all Democratic members of Congress in a state that, while very red, still about 30 or so percent, almost 40% of people vote for Vice President Harris in 2024. And you can see in Virginia, this is what the Democrats, this is one of the 10-to-1 maps that was proposed to Democrats. And it's not the map that they're proposing now, but that's very much the result they want. They want to pack all your rural voters who vote Republican to one district in the Southwest, and then bacon out all of your blue voting areas in Northern Virginia and Richmond to make as many districts as they can Democratic. And if you're looking at this blue sky skeet, it's Luis Lucas is president pro tem of the Virginia State Senate. And she has been saying 10-to-1, 10-to-1 for the last few months. She is determined to get 10-to-1 seats if the voters agree. And those of you who wish to look on blue sky, Senator Ted Cruz said it was quite undemocratic and unfair to divide up all the voters of Virginia and make a 10-to-1 map, which is certainly unfair to Republicans in that state. And she responded with saying, "You effing start it, we'll effing finish it." So you can see the mentality that this redistricting war is fought with in the zero-sum game. Mercy really isn't good for a party, however fair or ethical it might be. So also, let's not allow the Supreme Court to escape blame here. Why can't we sue in federal court over partisan gerrymanders? It's because in a case called Rucho v. Common Cause, the Supreme Court stated that partisan gerrymandering was non-justiciable. In other words, it was too difficult of an issue to be heard by the federal courts. The majority there justified its reason by saying that it was too difficult to find an objective test that could measure whether a district map is too gerrymandered or not. And that is just nonsense. I will say that is nonsense because we have many methods of statistical analysis and expert testimony that has been used in numerous states, including Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Utah, North Carolina, Florida, Maryland, that have looked at gerrymandered maps and found that they're gerrymandered and struck them down, placed them with fair maps. It is not true. It is simply an untrue assertion by that majority in the Rucho case. Furthermore, the Supreme Court isn't majority now, hasn't been content just to cut off angles to fight partisan gerrymandering in the federal courts. They've also said that they made it much harder to fight racial gerrymandering when you impermissibly use race above all other factors without a valid reason, like Voting Rights Act compliance. In a case out of South Carolina, Alexander versus South Carolina NAACP. And right now, in a case currently pending before the court, and then that was argued just a month ago or so, Louisiana v. Calais, they may rule that it violates the 14th Amendment entirely to draw districts that ensure a group of voters of color can elect candidates of their choice. And this has been a precedent that has existed for decades. And therefore, for lack of better terms, such a rule is saying it is unconstitutionally racist to remedy racial discrimination in politics by requiring that voters of color have an equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. That would be the interpretation that comes out should they rule that way. We're not sure when the ruling will come out, but the league has been amicus curiae from the court in all 3 of these cases, and we are strongly supporting voters of color and the challengers in Rucho who try to overturn their state's gerrymanders. So this is all rather depressing. And what are the solutions? So the biggest solution here is Congress. You have to reinvigorate Congress. Those of us who have read the Constitution, I'm sure it's all of us here, have remarked that Congress has the right to really regulate federal elections for the House and Senate. And therefore, you need Congress to pass a bill to ban partisan gerrymandering. And you could have Congress pass a bill to allow independent redistricting. So, in passing the bills that the League supports, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Native American Voting Rights Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, and DC statehood, this would actually have a nationwide standard that will ban partisan gerrymandering and create independent redistricting and fair redistricting for voters of color. Because otherwise, you'll have a zero-sum game where people are going to keep drawing to the maximum to defeat their enemies, as is in the two-party zero-sum game system. You can also potentially fix some of the bad Supreme Court decisions with legislation, because these rulings are not necessarily constitutional rulings. These are rulings based on interpretation of statutes. And if you have a bad statutory ruling from the Supreme Court, you can fix it with legislation. The next thing to do is also finding the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Courts have become often our last line of defense against partisan gerrymandering since the Supreme Court's decision in Rucho. So the League of Women Voters have been a plaintiff in states like Pennsylvania and Utah and Florida and Ohio in suing over partisan gerrymanders in state courts using state constitutional law. Many states have clauses that guarantee the right to a free and equal election, and therefore those types of clauses have been very much the foundation of many lawsuits to overturn gerrymander maps, as you saw in Pennsylvania or Utah and, well, Florida in the past. So who you elect to your state Supreme Court, who you select to your state Supreme Court, depending on your state's mode of selecting a Supreme Court justice, is as important as any gubernatorial election, any federal election. Who is on your state Supreme Court matters. Who's on your state courts matters. So voters should all know that when you vote on judges or when you vote for people who vote and select judges, that's the difference between whether your state has an avenue to fight partisan gerrymandering or not. Judges are all human. Sometimes they don't rule the way we'd like them to. And finally, electing good state legislators. If you have a good state legislature that will pass nonpartisan redistricting, then that makes life a lot easier than fighting in court. And that creates a much more stronger foundation for fair redistricting at all levels. So as voters, we must not neglect local and state elections. They do as much in redistricting and ensuring elections are fair than Congress or the Supreme Court does. In fact, one could argue many state legislatures and state constitutions are probably more pro small d democracy than our current Congress or Supreme Court majority. And as a personal plug for the League of Women Voters, what are we doing to fight back? So we're finding many states, all of our state leagues are doing heroic work on the ground in hostile environments, try to fight for fair redistricting. So in Missouri, they've tried to gerrymander their map as well by dividing the blue city of Kansas City, Missouri, into 3 pieces and snaking it off to the rural areas to drown out Democratic votes there. So in Missouri, we've been working with a coalition to gather signatures to place the new gerrymander map before the voters and cancel them with a referendum, since Missouri has a ballot initiative process. Texas, we filed amicus briefs to support challengers for the new gerrymander. In Utah, as I've said before, we were plaintiff in state court lawsuits to fight for fair maps. And in Maryland, Indiana, and Florida, we have testified or are testifying to try to fight those attempts to gerrymander in those state legislatures. So it's all a bit difficult, to say the least, to put it lightly, this fight we're in for fair districts. But I think it's a worthwhile principle to fight for. And I'll close before questions with this quote from Chief Justice Earl Warren. He wrote many of these decisions that created the modern standard for redistricting we have today. Legislators represent people, not trees or acres. Legislators are elected by voters, not farms or cities or economic interests. As long as ours is a representative form of government, and our legislatures are those instruments of government elected directly by and directly representative of the people, the right to elect legislators in a free and unimpaired fashion is a bedrock of our political system. So, with that, I think we should all believe as voters and keep fighting and keep striving for a system in which that is a reality across the whole country, no matter how a state voted or what geography might be, we should all have the right to fair districts at every level. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So I'll start off with a couple questions, and there are a couple of questions in chat, and I hope some more people will add questions there.
Of course.
Can you go back to the early stages of the formation of our country, and when was this an issue from the beginning, or were the states small enough so this was not an issue? Because it seems inherently wrong. It's very unfair. And with the founding fathers, the issues of, everyone having their vote, at least all white men having their vote initially, but the vote has been precious from, and then this flies in the face of that.
So I think there's two questions there. And the first question is this has bedeviled the United States from the very beginning, even before our current constitution was ratified. Some of you may have heard the story, and others you have not, where at the various elections to elect ratifying conventions for our current constitution, the anti-constitution factions in Virginia tried to gerrymander James Madison, one of the framers of our Constitution, out of a seat in the Constitutional Convention because they feared that if he were elected to that convention, his rhetorical abilities and respect that he had would ensure the Constitution was ratified by Virginia. And once Virginia ratified the Constitution, that would be it for them. So they attempted to gerrymander him out of a seat in the Constitutional Convention. And it took a lot of behind the scenes politicking from George Washington to get him elected anyway. And Virginia ratified the Constitution, and the rest is history on that front. But gerrymandering has been used in a lot of different states. I'm not going to list all of them out off the top of my head, but the very word gerrymander came from Elbridge Gerry, which was now repronounced to Jerry. He was a member of the Revolutionary generation, but he became governor of Massachusetts, I believe. And he ruthlessly drew districts to get rid of his political enemies, including a long district that kind of snaked around Boston, which was known as like the gerrymander because of its resemblance to a salamander or a dragon. So this has been going on for a long time. What's different now is that two things have really made gerrymandering much more effective. The first is computers. Now we have statistical analyses of voter behavior, voting patterns, much more precise ways to draw precincts, much more granular data on race and ethnicity and rural, and that allows gerrymanders to be drawn with surgical precision to achieve a certain result. And the second factor is just partisan polarization. When you have a very polarized electorate that no longer splits tickets anymore between, say, the president or Congress, for example, or even at the state level, like for a long time, Jim Jeffords was senator from Vermont, but Vermont voted blue really starting from the 90s onward. Or you can see in the South, like I mentioned earlier, you had the Arkansas Democrats held a majority in the state legislature until 2010, despite the fact that they hadn't voted Democratic since Bill Clinton. And the same held true for Georgia Democrats. They held on until 2004. North Carolina, they held on until 2010, with some ruthless gerrymandering of their own. But they held on for a very long time, even as the state turned redder and redder. Now you have this loss of ticket splitting, which meant that your gerrymanders will become much more durable because people no longer split their tickets between who's president, who's elected for senator or United States representative. Your gerrymanders become much more durable. And that's why people feel such confident drawing these crazy maps that I've just all shown you. So I hope that answered your question.
Okay, thank you. And then in the chat box, a question and a comment that are connected to each other from Marguerite and Lorinda and Beverly. Isn't gerrymandering dangerous for both parties? There are no guarantees that the votes will go the way they predict. And then also, Texas seems like a good example of this unpredictability, given the results of their recent special election.
Yes. So gerrymandering can be dangerous to a party if they don't draw it well enough. I'm saying for them. I'm not saying this in a general sense of like supporting gerrymandering. Um, it has happened before where sometimes you don't draw it well and things go very wrong. You can have states like um, Arkansas where they tried to draw two Democrat districts after 2010 because I think they still had the legislature until 2012. I misspoke earlier, but it backfired disastrously and they got no seats. Um, you could also have demographic change break the gerrymander, where voters' political behaviors massively shift. In 2017, you had the Virginia House of Delegates have a near Republican supermajority, but when the electorate in Northern Virginia really shifted blue massively, the gerrymander completely collapsed. You had Democrats pick up, I think, almost 17 seats, 15 or 17 seats in one night in the first election after the 2016 election because the voters' behavior shifted so much. So it is possible that you could have gerrymanders fail because humans can be fickle, voters can be fickle. But with the polarization I mentioned earlier, it is not as easy as it is for a gerrymander to fail as it is now. So it is dangerous to some parties. But whether or not the Texas gerrymander will fail, I can't say. I believe there's another question there, or I have only one question to answer.
Yeah, there was a comment there, and it's connected to that same question.
Okay.
The unpredictability with Texas as an example. Yeah. So with the Voting Rights Act, of course, we have more groups than just. I mean, people of color is just a very broad term.
Yes.
So, in different parts of the country, the effort would be to respect different groups. For example, it might be a region where there's a strong indigenous American population, or in the Southwest, the Hispanic population. So it's not always like Black Americans.
Yes, yes, that's correct. So the Voting Rights Act applies to all voters of color. So you have many districts, for example, in Los Angeles, where I'm located, that are drawn to ensure that Latino voters can elect a candidate of their choice, or Asian voters can elect candidates of their choice. Um, the same holds true for many Native American areas. You'll see many state legislatures in Montana, North Dakota, and places like that where there are Native American reservations. In Arizona, for example, you have to draw districts where Native American voters can elect candidates of their choice. And even North Dakota, that's still a battle with litigation that's going on as to how many seats are required to be drawn for Native American voters to have an equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. There are some circuits where you are allowed to draw so-called coalition districts, where say, for example, if a city has multiple different groups of peoples of color, like Mexicans or like Hispanics, Asians, and Black voters, um, you can draw a district that has majority minority, but has multiple different groups of voters of color. If you can satisfy the other um, factors I previously said earlier, like you can create a cohesive, compact district, and that there is racially polarized voting between all the voters of color and the majority white voters, and that there's a lack of equal openness to the political system in that jurisdiction. So, for example, in Houston, you should be able to draw those kind of coalition districts, but the Fifth Circuit recently ruled that that was not required under its interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. In Texas. So unfortunately, that's not possible in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi anymore. But you are allowed to. The Voting Rights Act doesn't only apply to just Black voters. Of course, it applies for all voters of color.
A comment from Kate. I'll have to be careful how I read this. Trying to figure out how to say one of these words. For a deep dive into modern partisan gerrymandering, read Rat F. By David Daly.
I've heard of that book.
Word in there, but so is it a book you're familiar with?
I haven't read it yet, but I've definitely heard the title, and you can see the effects of what that book describes in a lot of our elections today.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Another question. I love this question here. What would our system potentially look like if we could eliminate gerrymandering? Would the two-party system be more easily challenged?
Well, if we had no gerrymandering, what you would have is a much more system that the voters could actually effectively elect representatives that carry out their preferences. You can see, for example, that you may have, for example, states that very much want Medicaid expansion, but because the states are gerrymandered, it's impossible for them to elect a majority that would actually carry out that wish. Or you may want some states that would like looser gun control, for example, or more residents that want looser gun control. But if you have a gerrymandered state that does not want that, you will probably never get a chance to have that legislation passed. And if you don't have a ballot initiative system, you may be fresh out of luck, for lack of a better term. So a lack of gerrymandering would actually ensure that the voters can more effectively have representatives that do what they want. Like if you think of your representative as your agent, it's like I'm asking you to act in my best interest according to my preferences, um, and for the best interest of my state or city or my country. If I feel that you're not performing that well, I should be able to fire you in a thing called an election, a performance review process called an election, and find a better agent for myself, and my people. So it would be a better country if we had no gerrymandering, um, from all parties, really. But we don't live in that world, unfortunately. One day we may get there. And as to the two-party system, it's not just gerrymandering that preserves a two-party system in the United States. And obviously, I do not control the league's position on the two-party system. I'm speaking as just a general factual matter. A two-party system really is preserved by a multitude of factors beyond gerrymandering. It's first past the post, elections. The primary system in the United States really preserves a two-party system because you effectively create kind of loose coalitions of groups within party apparatuses, um, and that are much more different than, say, European style parties. For example, we cannot expel party members in the US as easily as we can in many European countries. Like in parliamentary systems, like in say, Germany, which has partial proportional system, you have to vote the party line in the Bundestag. If you don't, you will be expelled straight out of the caucus and party membership. In many parliamentary systems, you can deselect candidates that do not vote the party line on important issues like budget or votes of confidence. That we have no way of doing that in the United States beyond caucuses maybe withdrawing the party endorsement in some states, or the primary voters having to toss them out um, at the next primary election instead of like immediate expulsion. We also don't have any so-called proportional representation where you have like each party put a list of voters, depending on the system you have proportional representation, you use a list of candidates, and you say if you get 30% of the vote across, say, a state or a nation, 30% of the top 30% people on your list will become members of your parliament. Um, Obviously, there's ranked choice voting that's been tried in some jurisdictions, and many of our state leagues have passed or are trying to pass that in their states. And that's a way to get third-party representation potentially into government. But there's a lot of steps if you want multi-party democracy that go beyond banning gerrymandering. So please ban gerrymandering for everyone. That would be great if we have a national solution so we don't have zero-sum games where game theory demands you take out your opponent's districts with a chainsaw and annihilate the representation. Um, but if you want a multi-party system, you'll have to do more than just ban gerrymandering.
You just mentioned proportionate representation, and of course in the Senate we have a different issue, and it's really, I mean, it's something that profits Vermont. It helps us a lot. So we have two U.S. senators in our. We have what 630,000 people, and the state of California has two U.S. senators. So there's that, that's not proportionate, obviously. However, in the structure of the Senate, the total numbers, there are a lot of small states like Vermont, or smaller states, not quite as small as we are, that are conservative. So that through the Midwest, the conservatives end up having a, a disproportionate voice in the Senate. Can you talk about that at all?
Sure. I think people may also be wondering why we have the Senate system at all. Like, why isn't it also struck down as not as violative of one person, one vote? And the Supreme Court actually said we can't strike it down because it's in the Constitution. We have no way to unilaterally amend the very clear text of the Constitution, giving each state um, two senators. So it is an issue of the Senate favoring more conservative um, politics now simply because of the composition of uh, certain states' electorates, like you've said, Tom. And that's simply just fact, which is what can help balance it out. Maybe perhaps the wrong word is balance is the wrong word, but perhaps along with whether we think that's like an acceptable bias is, I think, perhaps a separate issue. What we don't have in the Senate right now here is really full representation of all the people of the United States. For example, Washington, D.C. has a larger population than many states, but it has no representation, not a state. And it should have statehood. We at the League believe it should have statehood because they're our fellow Americans, and there's no reason for them to treat like some colony, which they are being treated like one right now, um, when they're are equally citizens, like with our all obligations of citizenship. They have to pay taxes. Many of them serve in the military. They have to obey the federal laws like we do. So perhaps the first issue is not whether we can change the composition of how conservatively the Senate is. Perhaps the first question we can ask right now is who gets to be able to be even in the arena at all? Like DC should be a state. Should Puerto Rico be a state, for example? That's not something the league has a position on. That's for the Puerto Rico to decide. But Puerto Rico's bigger than many states, population-wise. They have been citizens since the 1900s. They have fought in our wars, died in our wars, pay our taxes, just as like we have, so many Vermonters, so many Californians have. So we should consider that. And what about Guam? What about American Samoa? You know, they have to live under us too. So I think the larger question is not just the way the Senate is biased, but whether it's how are we representing all Americans? Are we? Because we're not, really. We have these strange uh, territorial arrangements that aren't really equal if we look at it just from objective fact. Just not even me speaking as a member of the league. It's just me as a regular citizen looking at it and seeing what's going on right now.
And Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, both, each of them is larger than the state of Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Are there other issues? We have a thank you. Thanks so much for your thoughtful responses in the chat box. If other people have additional questions, please get them in now. And Thomas, are there aspects of this that some things that we either started on and didn't go through enough? Do you want to add more to, or?
Probably the one thing I've forgotten to put in the slides now I think about it is the ballot initiative. If many states have enacted fair redistricting via the ballot initiative and created independent redistricting commissions, California's was created that way. Um, you know, Colorado, Michigan have all created independent commissions via the ballot initiative. So as we think about just fighting for fair districting everywhere and hoping for a national solution with Congress, and hopefully electing a president who will sign fair redistricting legislation into law if passed by Congress, and then dealing with the filibuster as we might have to, probably will have to, in passing this legislation. The states have a huge role to play here, not just in terms of the legislator drawing the district, but also whether you're able to have a independent commission drawing your districts ahead of after the 2030 census, or whether you can cancel a gerrymandered map like Missouri is trying to do. Protecting your state's ballot initiative process and the voters' access to it is very much a vital fight that every voter can engage in now if your state has one. And probably another thing to mention is that I mentioned earlier that state Supreme Courts are really a last line of defense. And a lot of these anti-democracy legislators are really trying to destroy the independence of the state Supreme Court. In Montana, they tried electing the state Supreme Court by district so they could gerrymander themselves a more pliable majority. That was stopped, thankfully. They tried packing the court in Montana, which has a fair independent redistricting commission, and they didn't like the state Supreme Court. They tried packing the court by adding justices. It was stopped because some legislators said, no, I don't want to do that. In Utah, they passed a law to add two justices to the state Supreme Court after they didn't like the rulings that were 5-0 against them, they meaning the legislature. And so they're hoping to have these new justices on board before the appeals are heard in our state court case that got us fair districts in Utah. And other states were like Ohio, they just ignored the state Supreme Court and just drew a gerrymander anyway because they didn't have a means to enforce rulings striking down the gerrymander districts the Ohio legislature and commission passed. So it's not just about having a state Supreme Court, it's defending its independence and who's on it. That truly matters too. And if voters don't pay attention, it is much harder to fix it afterwards. You can put the fire out now when you see the smoke, or you can let the whole house burn down and have to rebuild from anew. I think we'd all know which one we'd rather choose in that analogy.
Okay, thank you. Here's a comment from Robert about Puerto Rico. The 2 senators per state was a necessary compromise, so they say, to keep the slave-owning southern colonies to join the United States by signing the Constitution. You want to say anything about that? Right?
Well, I think it might have. Well, the small states, again, I'm not a professor of American history. So I don't want to say something wrong, but small states pressure wasn't just from the South. It was also states like Delaware and New Jersey, who very much were worried that they would be swamped by Virginia and New York and Pennsylvania in the new United States. So the Senate did eventually, yes, turn out to be very much an instrument of what we call the slave power before the Civil War. And even then, to block the abuse of Senate rules to block civil rights legislation is well known. But the Senate structure of itself didn't just come from concerns of smaller enslaver states. It also came from states like New Jersey and Delaware, who weren't the biggest or most powerful slaveholding states. But they also very much jealously guarded their sovereignty as well at the Constitutional Convention. And so that's part of the root of these compromises that are creating our current structure of government.
Okay, this is inspiring some more questions. So from Marguerite, isn't the Electoral College also unfair in how we elect the president?
Yes, this is why the League supports a moonshot to get rid of the Electoral College by either the Constitutional Amendment or the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, where enough states comprising majority of electoral votes just say, we'll award our electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. It is unfair. It is not representative of a majority of the people if you can have the Electoral College go against the popular vote. And it's not about even protecting small states, which some defenders of the Electoral College say it does. It's about getting the right combination of states that get you to 270. I mean, no one's gone to Wyoming to campaign for anyone's votes there. I rather doubt it. And the same, I think, holds true for, Vermont, just because it's a safe blue small state. No one's probably going there. They're only going to New Hampshire next door because it's one of the first primaries. That's why they go there, not because they think like New Hampshire has some special merit as a small light blue state, particularly. Of course, I'm not insulting our New Hampshire friends, but like no one going like we all know why politicians do all the stuff they do in New Hampshire with all their events and Carhartt uniforms and going to the various grills and dinners and rubber chicken dinners. It's about getting the right combination of states in Electoral College.
since we're right across the river from New Hampshire, we get to go over there if we want to meet candidates. That's convenient for us. Do
We
you
never
think,
get that in California. We just get fundraisers to Beverly Hills. They rush over to Beverly Hills and put their hats out.
do you think that the census should be done every 5 years? People in the U.S. move frequently.
I don't have a position on that. I'm not the expert of the census. That's more for the advocacy team at LDVUS, who knows far more about the census than myself. The census is a massive undertaking. Even getting a good count every 10 years requires a massive investment of federal resources, time, and effort, even in the best of circumstances. I will say, though, that ahead of 2030, we should all in our various states be very much pressuring our state governments to get a maximum count of all the people. Um, because that determines so much about our apportionment, the resources the federal government allocates, and just an accurate statistical picture of the country. So it's not just the feds who are doing the census. The more outreach the state government, local government does, the more complete of a count we have. So value the census in its current 10-year form. I can't say whether a 5-year census would be a better measure than what we have now, though. That's for other experts to comment on.
So Vermont, unfortunately, is one of the states that is losing population right now. But one of the absolute wonderful things about living here is that we have access to all our political leaders. It is anybody who wants to meet U.S. Senator, U.S. Representative, Governor. There are plenty of opportunities to meet everyone. I have a friend who moved here from California several years ago, and she had only been here a few months, and she met Senator Leahy, and she was astounded. She said, "In California, you don't meet senators."
No, we can't. We
Yeah,
can't dream of that.
yeah. So let's see. From Robert, Thomas, thanks for sharing your knowledge and insights in a very accessible and even an entertaining manner. Yes, this
Of
has.
course.
Yep. Thank you. A very lightning presentation and discussion from Marguerite. And unless anybody else has any other comments, or Thomas, if you have anything else you want to add, or we're good. We've already asked you that once.
No, I mean, thank you all for listening to this on a Wednesday night. I truly appreciate the attention you all are paying to this, and I hope you all keep being active on these issues. Join your local league if you haven't already. We can always use more members. And I will, of course, I'm biased as an LDVUS employee, but I very much enjoy all the services our local leagues do. We can't do it without them, and the services they provide for public forums, informing people about legislation, and even observing a local government meeting, which the local newspapers are gone in many places, no one does anymore, are all vital services. And your membership and your support, even just a support or volunteering for your local league, is quite frankly investment into your local democracy as well. So please stay active and please vote, because I can do all the lawsuits I would like to do, but without an active and engaged citizenry who cares about democracy, no amount of lawyers can fix it. So hopefully, my work will make your voting easier, and your voting will make my life easier and my work easier.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this back to Kate.
Thank you, Thomas, especially for the pitch for the league. And Tom for tonight's expert moderation. Tune in, everybody, next Thursday or next month, March 11, when Secretary of State Sarah Copeland Hanses will tell us about 2 bills affecting voter rights. The SAVE Act, which I believe is right now before the House of Representatives, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act, to wrap up our season. Thank you.